Okay, guys, picture this. It's July 1969 at Lake Worth, Texas. It's just after midnight, and a group of teenagers has their car parked on this silent stretch of road near a place called Greer Island. Their windows were down, the radio was playing low, and they had that warm summer air drifting in off that water. It's that kind of night where nothing feels dangerous. You got just kids laughing, talking, and enjoying the evening. Then, while they're sitting there giggling and having a good time, something hits the roof of their car. And I'm not talking a little hit, I'm talking about a huge slam. It felt like the entire vehicle rocked just like a tree had fallen on it. And for a split second, everyone there was frozen in their seats. Then they hear it. They heard loud scratching. It was like heavy claws dragging slowly across the roof of that car. They said that it reminded them of like a rake that was going across a chalkboard, if you can imagine that. And that's when they all started screaming. The driver, he slams the car into gear and he floors it. And the tires that was spinning on that gravel as they were hauling butt down that road trying to get away from whatever it was that landed on the top of that car. And as they sped off, one of them looked back and got a glance through that rearview window of what this thing was. And whatever it was that they did encounter that night, it seemed like it was waiting just for them out there at Lake Worth. And before that summer was over, there was a lot more people that reported seeing this thing. Welcome back, listeners and watchers, to another dark and disturbing episode of Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and tonight we're talking about something that has been terrifying people across the U.S. for over half a century. We are finally digging into that creature known as the Goatman. Now, if you spent any time digging through American cryptid lore, more than likely you have probably heard that name before. They say that it is a towering creature. He's half man, half goat. And it's something that stalks lonely bridges, wooded back roads, and parked cars in the dead of night. Now, most people, they treat the Goatman like it's just another campfire story. Just something teenagers tell each other to scare the crap out of their friends, and I'm sorry if you hear my dog in the background, she's chasing after something outside. Shut up, Rosie! But once you start digging into those reports, you find those police statements, those old newspaper headlines, and witnesses who still refuse to go back to the places where they saw this thing. After listening to all that, you might just change your mind as to what this thing might really be. Tonight, we're diving into 3 of the most disturbing encounters that I could find that was tied to this legend. The first one, we have the Lake Worth Monster in Texas. And not far from there, also in Texas, we're going to talk about the history of the Goatman's Bridge. And believe me, that gets dark. Then we're going to talk about the violent waves of sightings that hit Maryland in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, some of these stories, I admit, they might be folklore, they might be misunderstandings, but some of them, they're just a little bit harder to explain away. Now, before we jump in, believe me, I hate asking, but if you like deep dives just like this, I would love you to do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, pound down on the like button, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on a weekly upload. Believe me, it helps out more than you know, and from the bottom of my heart, I deeply appreciate your trust. And I'd be honored to have you on our team of truth seekers. Okay, now that we've got that out the way, let's talk about the importance of these confessions. You see, different people can look at the exact same event and walk away with a completely different explanation. You got one person that sees monsters when another person sees a prank. Then you have others that see it as folklore, and then you have others that see this thing like it shouldn't exist. And that's the thing about confessions just like these. Because remember, the truth, it often depends on where you're standing. And that, my friends, is relative perspective. Okay, y'all, let's go back to the moment that kicked this legend into overdrive. It happened in Lake Worth, Texas around July 10th of 1969. Now, if you've never been there, Lake Worth sits just north of Fort Worth, Texas. Back then, it was mostly quiet woods, dirt roads, and little hidden clearings where people would park at night just to get away from the city. And one of those places was known as Greer Island. In the late 60s, it was dark, it was isolated, and just far enough away from town where teenagers could pull up, kill the headlights, and have a little privacy. And that's exactly what four young kids decided to do that night. You had two young couples, probably up to no good, pulled up just past midnight. The air was thick with that Texas summer heat. Anyone that lives down here will know exactly what the heck I'm talking about. They finally pulled up, they got there, and they found what they thought was a perfect spot. They had the windows rolled down, the radio was playing low, and everybody was just talking and laughing, or that's what they told the police. They said that everything seemed fine when they first got there. Nothing looked or felt out of the ordinary, until suddenly something had jumped down from out of the trees. It wasn't walking and it wasn't running. It dropped down, and I mean it hit hard. The impact, it slammed so hard on the roof of that car that the whole vehicle, it rocked on its suspension. And understandably, for half a second, nobody in that car, they understood what was going on. And that's when the scratching, it started. They said it sounded like long claws that was dragging across that metal roof. Now, I want you to imagine the kind of sound that would produce. They said it was like someone taking a rake and slowly pulling it across a chalkboard. And everyone inside that car was yelling as loud as they could and doing their best looking out the windows trying to figure out what the heck this thing was. And that's when things went from terrifying to something out of a nightmare. One of the girls sitting near one of the windows, she started screaming as loud as she could because they said that a huge arm had come through that open window. It was hairy, thick, and covered in coarse white fur. And in some accounts, they said it even had scales. The hand, if you could call it that, it had long claws and it started grabbing her. And not just that either, it was trying to yank her out of that small window. Now, can you imagine how scared that you would be if something like that grabbed you and tried to pull you out of a window? Now, of course, she was screaming and fighting and grasping at anything that she could get her hands on, trying to stay inside that car. Now, I want you to imagine, I want you to put yourself in that car. I want you to think about how you would handle the panic and the fear of that attack. Because I think these guys did all that they could. They did all they could to get her back in the window, which they did, and they did all they could to get away. Now, while the others are fighting this thing and screaming their lungs out, the driver, he does the only thing that he can think to do. He slams the car into drive and he pounds his foot on the gas. The tires, they start spinning on the gravel for a second before it catches. And the car, it jets down the road, sliding and shooting gravel all over the place. All these kids wanted to do was, of course, to get away from Gur Island and that creature. Now, as they sped off, whatever was on the roof of that car, it slid off into the darkness. And seconds later, one of the guys, he turns around and he looks through the back window to see if he could get a glimpse of this thing. And that's when he sees it standing right in the middle of the road, lit up for just a moment in those taillights. He said this thing was huge. He said it was at least 7 feet tall, covered in white fur, and he said its body was shaped like a man, but its head was like a goat. And not only that, he said it had long horns curling up from the side of its head. And he said those eyes were glowing back at them from those red taillights. One other thing that really shocked them is that this creature, it just stood there. It didn't chase after them. They drove for miles before finally pulling over, and their hands were shaking so hard that they could barely open the door to get out. Now, when they finally did, they stepped out of the car and they walked around to look at the damage. That's when things got even crazier, because there were long, deep gashes running down the side of that car. They said it was about 18 inches long, cut into that metal panel like someone had dragged a blade straight through it. Now, this was not a dent, and they said it wasn't just a scratch. This was a huge tear in that steel. Now, I want you to think about how hard that would be to do. The cars that were made back in the late 60s, they weren't made out of like soda cans like some of the stuff that we got today. Those cars, they were built tough. Now, I know they weren't armor plated, but they were still tough enough that you don't just rip into it by accident. Now, when the group, they finally made it to their police station to report what happened, the officers at first, they treated it exactly like what you'd expect. They thought maybe these kids were telling a wild story or someone was out there trying to scare them. But when the officers, they walked outside and they took a look at that car and they saw the damage, and suddenly, that's when the laughter, it stopped. Because whatever caused that gash, it was not easy to explain. Now, within hours, this story, it started spreading all across Fort Worth. The next day, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram read a headline that people still talk about to this day. The headline read, "Fishy Man-Goat Terrified Couples at Lake Worth." And that one article, it lit a fuse. Because once that story had hit the newspapers, something really strange started happening. Because more people, they began coming forward. And you had more sightings and more reports of something large moving through those woods at Lake Worth. And you had the same description from all these other witnesses. They said they saw a huge figure with pale fur, and some said that he had scales and horns and those glowing red eyes. And that's not the only crazy thing. Not long, just maybe a couple of days after that car incident, accounts say that about 40 people went out to Greer Island to investigate this thing for themselves. And that's when a majority of those people, they said that they claimed that they saw this creature standing far off in the distance. Then it picked up this big tire and it hurled it at the crowd. Some claim that he threw that tire so hard that it flew over 500 feet right towards them. And not long after that incident, the police, they started getting call after call of reports of people seeing this thing around the same area. And that's when they named him the Lake Worth Monster. And suddenly those encounters at Greer Island, it didn't look like a standalone incident anymore. Because whatever those teenagers they ran into that night and what that large group witnessed was still out there. And over the next few weeks, like I said, a lot more people were going to see this thing. All right, y'all, the Lake Worth Monster, it terrified people in Texas in the late 60s. But if you talk to folks a little further north in the state, they'll tell you that the Goatman, it didn't start at Lake Worth. They'll tell you that it lived somewhere else, about 40 miles north of Dallas in Denton County. There's an old iron bridge out there that locals have been avoiding after dark for decades. The real name is the Old Altman Bridge, but hardly anybody calls it that anymore. Most people just call it the Goatman's Bridge. Now, if you drive out there today, it doesn't look like much. It's a narrow iron truss bridge that was built in 1884, and it stretches directly over Hickory Creek. It's got trees crowding both sides of the road, and the woods around it, it gets thick and dark fast once that sun goes down. Now, during the day, it feels quiet, almost peaceful. But at night, people will tell you that place feels a lot different. And according to local legend, the darkness that's tied to that bridge goes all the way back to the 1930s. Now, this story gets dark, so if you have any kids in the room, please tell them to cover their ears or maybe walk out or tell them to leave because this really gets dark. Back then, people said that there was a black goat farmer by the name of Oscar Washburn, and he lived right near that bridge. Now, by all accounts, he was doing really, really well for himself. He raised the goats, he sold the milk, he sold the meat, pretty much did all he could with those goats to make a living. And he hung this big sign outside of his property to advertise his business. And that's when people, they started calling him the Goatman because of the livestock that he raised. But this was the Deep South in the 1930s. And success like that, it didn't sit well with some people. According to the legend, there was members of the KKK that showed up one night. They dragged Washburn to the bridge, they looped a rope around his neck, and they tossed him over. But when they climbed down into the creek to make sure the job was done, they realized Oscar was gone. Hell, they couldn't find any sign of him at all. And after that, they couldn't find him. They decided to do something way, way worse to Oscar's family. They decided to burn his house down with his wife and kids inside. And from that night forward, people say the spirit of the Goatman had haunted that bridge ever since. Now, before we go any further, I want to be fair here. Historians, they've searched records for years, and there's no real documentation that Mr. Washburn, he actually existed. But here's the thing, even if that story's just folklore, the reputation of that bridge, it's very real. Because for decades, people have been reporting strange things happening out there. Things like footsteps when nobody else is around, strange noises in the woods, and a crazy weird feeling, a heavy oppressing feeling, like something is watching you from the tree line. But the story that really put the Goatman's Bridge on the map is something that the locals have been daring each other to do for years. If you want to meet the Goatman, what you do is you drive to the center of that bridge at night, you turn off your headlights, you shut your engine off, and then you knock 3 times on that iron. And some say you don't have to knock, you just honk your horn 3 times. The idea, it's all the same. They say what you're doing is you're calling this thing. Now, most of the time, nothing happens. At least that's what people tell themselves. But every once in a while, there's someone that claims that that bridge, it answers back. Visitors had reported hearing heavy footsteps moving across metal that sounded like it was coming up right behind them. They said it didn't sound like human footsteps. They said it was something heavier and something much, much darker. And you have others that have said that they've seen glowing eyes looking at them from the tree line. And there's a few people that claim that something even stranger has happened. One visitor described standing alone on the bridge when he suddenly heard the sound of hooves hitting metal. He said it was slow at first, but they got a lot faster. It was like something large was walking straight towards him. He turned around expecting to see someone playing a prank on him, but the bridge behind him, it was empty. And that sound, it kept getting closer and closer. That's when he said that the entire bridge had started vibrating under his feet. Then he said he felt something grab him and throw him down to the ground. Now after that, he jumped to his feet and he said he ran his butt off. Now maybe that was just his imagination, or maybe it was just the nerves that come along with standing on a crazy bridge like that with a crazy reputation. But if you ask some of the people who live around Denton County, a lot of them will tell you the same thing. They don't knock on Goatman's bridge, and they definitely don't stick around there after midnight. Because whether the Goatman had started as a murder farmer, a ghost story, or something way darker, that bridge, some say, still feels like it belongs to something else. And a lot of the people who've been out there at night say the same thing. They say it feels like you're not supposed to be there. And if you stay too long, something might decide to remind you to get the hell away. Okay, y'all, the stories that we talked about so far are pretty unsettling. But this next one, this one gets a lot darker. Because in the early 1970s, the Goatman legend, it didn't just scare a few people near a lake or on a bridge. It actually spread through an entire town, Prince George's County, Maryland. And the year was 1971. Back then, Bowie, it wasn't the suburban area that it is today. Large sections of the county, it was still farmland and thick woods, with railroad tracks cutting through those trees and long dark roads running through scattered houses. This place, it was peaceful and quiet. The kind of place where kids could ride their bikes, after sunset, and the parents, they weren't much worried about what was in those woods. That's up until people, they started seeing things. You had the local newspapers, they started running stories about strange creatures wandering near a place called Fletchertown Road. Witnesses, they described a huge figure running through the trees on two legs. They said it was about 7 feet tall and hair was covering its entire body. And several people, they mentioned the same disturbing detail. When this creature, it moved through the brush, it made this high-pitched squealing sound. They said that it wasn't a growl and it didn't sound like a howl. It was something that some witnesses said that sounded half human and half animal. Police, they started receiving all kinds of crazy calls from scared residents. People, they reported hearing something dark and unnatural moving through the woods at night. And at first, the officers, they treated it just like you'd expect. They said that it was probably a prank, like someone was dressed up in a costume trying to scare people. But then something happened that made the whole situation feel a lot more real. There was a girl by the name of April Edwards that lived right near those woods. One evening, her and some friends were standing outside of her house when they heard some really strange noises coming from the tree line. They then heard huge branches snapping, and they could look out in the tree line and they could see something that was moving really big saplings as it crept closer. And not long after that is when they saw it. A tall, unnatural looking figure standing right there in the woods. Her friend by the name of John Hayden later described it as being 7 feet tall, covered in thick hair, as huge as a bodybuilder, and it was walking upright on two legs. And then he described that unearthly sound. A loud and creepy squeal that had those kids hauling butt back to the house. They thought everything was over when they got home and they stopped hearing those screams. But they were way, way wrong, because the next morning is what really disturbed them. April, she had a 10-month-old puppy by the name of Ginger. The dog, she had been outside all night. Now, April reported hearing that dog going crazy throughout the night, and then all of a sudden, she didn't hear a thing. Now, she thought nothing of it at the time, but when they woke up and she went outside to check on Ginger the next morning, poor Ginger, she was missing. Now, they searched for what seemed to be hours, and after a while, the family, it eventually found something lying near the railroad tracks. They walked up on it and realized the worst. It was Ginger's head. But the crazy thing is, the rest of Ginger's body, it was never found. They were devastated, as you can imagine, because they just knew that something horrible had happened. And years later, April Edwards would still talk about what happened that night. And she said something that stuck with a lot of people who followed this story. She said that people came here and called it folklore. And the papers made us out to be ignorant hillbillies who didn't know any better. But what I saw was real, and I know I'm not crazy. Whether the creature that she saw had anything at all to do with what happened to her dog, nobody could prove that. And that's the sad part about this story. Around the same time, something else had started happening around Bowie. The stories, they were getting darker, and I mean way darker. Because people, they weren't claiming to just see creatures anymore. They were claiming that this thing was armed. Whispers, they started spreading through town that the Goatman, he was actually carrying an axe. Some reports say that people could see the blade glinting in the moonlight in those woods. And others claim that they could hear the sound of a huge axe hitting trees throughout the night. Now, at first, the claims, they sounded ridiculous, until the reports came in from teenagers that went parking around the back roads in Bowie. One group had claimed that something had rushed their car from the woods while they were sitting there along a quiet road late one night. They said that a tall creature had bursted out of the tree line, and it was holding what looked like a double-bladed axe. And before they could even react, this thing ran up to their car and it started swinging. They said that the first blow had slammed directly on their hood. And as you can imagine, they said that the metal, it buckled instantly. Then another swing, it crashed down onto the roof, and that's when glass, it shattered everywhere. The teenagers, they were screaming as the driver, he slammed the gas pedal onto the floor, and that car, it jetted forward down that road. But unlike that Lake Worth monster, this monster, he didn't just stand there. He started chasing after them. And he was swinging that damn axe again and again at the back of that car as it sped away. Now, by the time that they reached town and they stopped under this street light, the car, it looked like it had been through a wreck. They said it had deep cuts in the metal, it had broken glass everywhere, and terrified teenagers trying to explain what the hell just happened. Now, you ask, could that story have been exaggerated? Of course it could. Could it have been a prank? Yes. But when you look at every single thing that happened in Bowie that year, you had the sightings, you had the police calls, the frightened residents, and a lot of missing pets. It's easy to understand how the legend of the Maryland Goatman, it took on a life of its own. Because whether people, they saw a monster or something that they simply just couldn't explain, for that year in the woods around Bowie, Maryland, and the people that lived there felt like they belonged to something else. And according to the stories that came out of that summer, whatever was walking through those woods, it definitely wasn't afraid of people. In fact, it sounded like it was hunting them. Okay, y'all, at this point, I don't like to admit, but we've got a problem. Because what we just walked through, it doesn't line up completely. We've got something tearing into a car in Texas in 1969. We've got a bridge in Denton County that people won't even stand on after midnight. And then we've got an entire community in Maryland calling police about something crazy going on in those woods over there. You've got different states and different environments, but you've got the same kind of description. You got tall, hairy, walking upright, and something that's just wrong. So the question, to me, it's obvious. What in the heck is this thing? And depending on who you ask, you're probably going to get a very different answer. Let's start with a theory that's tied directly to Texas. If you talk to locals around that Goatman's Bridge, a lot of them, they don't believe that this is some unknown animal. They think it's something that used to be human or much darker. Like we said before, the story, it goes back to the legend of the Goatman, and his name is Oscar Washburn, a man who, if the legend was true, was murdered in a brutal and hateful way. And the idea is, whatever happened to him, it didn't end on that night. It actually changed him. It turned him into something else, something tied to that bridge, something that never leaves. and I don't think that it has plans to. Now, like I said earlier, historians they have not been able to confirm this story. But here's what gets interesting. Places with violent histories have a tendency to have a crazy reputation. And over time, people they start experiencing things that they just can't explain. So, whether or not Mr. Washburn is real, the fear that's tied to that bridge, it definitely is. Now, let's go ahead and check out another theory. You've got people who think that this is not a spirit at all. They think that it's a living creature, it's something physical, and it's something that's been here for a very long time. And when you look at the description from Lake Worth in Maryland, there are definitely some similarities that stand out. You have witnesses in both places that describe a few things, like a tall, upright figure, he's covered in hair or fur, he tends to hang out in wooded areas, and he makes sounds that don't match any kind of animal that they've ever heard. That's why some people they group the Goatman in with other cryptids, creatures just like Bigfoot. These are unknown species that live in remote areas and show themselves occasionally. And if that's the case, then what those teenagers saw in Texas and what those people reported in Maryland could be the same type of creature altogether. It's just in a different part of the country. Now, this next theory, it tends to make people the most uncomfortable because it involves something that's a lot closer to home. You have a place called the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. Now, understand that this place is located not far from where all those sightings were there in Maryland. It's a real place, it's government run, and it's been around for decades. Now, officially, it's used for agricultural studies, studies like livestock and crop science, those kind of things. But over the years, of course, the rumors they started circulating. Stories about experiments, about scientists trying to push the envelope, and like any other dark conspiracy, those rumors, they turned into something much more darker. People, they began claiming that the Goatman wasn't a creature that was found out in the wild. It was something that they thought might have been created. They thought it could be a hybrid, part human and part animal. And according to the legend, something went way wrong. They said either the experiment that they worked on escaped, or the scientist that was behind all this mess, he became the creature and escaped himself. Now, I want to be clear, there's no evidence at all that anything like that happened. But I think the timing is what keeps people talking, because those rumors, they showed up right around the same time that those sightings did back in 1971. The same area and the same description. And once an idea like that gets into people's heads, it's hard as hell to go away. Now, here's one more theory that we need to look into. One that doesn't involve ghosts or secret experiments or even unknown species. It just involves people. Some believe that the Goatman legend, it started with a real person, someone who lived out in those woods, someone who either wanted to scare people or lost a grip on reality completely. And over time, you had sightings, rumor, and fear that turned that person into something much bigger than what he actually was. A story, a legend, and then a monster. But here's the problem with that explanation. Legends, they don't usually leave behind physical evidence. They don't trigger multiple reports from people that don't even know each other. And they definitely don't stick around for decades. So, where does all these theories, where does it leave us? We've got a possible spirit tied to a violent past, a possible unknown creature moving through the wooded areas, a rumored government experiment, or a story that grew out of fear and took on a life of its own. It's either one of those, or it's maybe something else entirely. But after everything that we've walked through tonight, there's one thing that's hard to ignore. Whatever people were seeing in Texas and whatever people were reporting in Maryland, it seemed to follow the same pattern. It stayed close to the woods, and it always seemed to appear right when people thought they were alone. And of course, there are plenty of people that will tell you what we just heard is all nonsense. That every single one of these stories has a perfectly reasonable explanation. And maybe they're right. But when you start digging into what those explanations actually are, that's when things, they kind of start falling apart. Okay, guys, let's be real for a second. Everything that we've talked about tonight, the attacks, the sightings, and the stories, There are a lot of people that will hear all of that and immediately say, no, that stuff's not real. And honestly, that's fair. Because if you're looking at this from the outside, there are explanations for almost every single part of the Goatman legend, at least on paper. Let's go ahead and start back in Texas. Skeptics say that the Lake Worth monster was nothing more than a prank that basically it got out of control. Now, according to some accounts, there was a man that came forward that claimed that he and a friend, they dressed up like a creature and they admitted going out there and trying to scare those couples that were parked out there. And if you think about it, that part, it really makes sense. I mean, that would explain a lot. You had teenagers out there late at night telling a wild story after getting scared. That definitely happens. But to me, here's where it starts to get a little shaky. Because pranks, they usually don't involve something hitting a car hard enough to make it shake. Some people said it felt like a tree actually hit that car. And they definitely don't explain a deep gash in the side of a car that was seen by police and multiple witnesses. So yeah, it could have been a prank, maybe, but that doesn't explain everything. Then you have the Goatman's Bridge. Skeptics will tell you straight up that there are no records of Oscar Washburn. There was no verified lynching and there was no historic proof. And they're right, that part of the story is most certainly folklore. Now, as for the footsteps, the voices, and the feeling of something watching you, they'll say that that's just your brain doing what your brain usually does in the dark. Filling in the blanks, turning shadows into shapes, and turning sounds into something that they're not. And again, that definitely makes sense. Because if you stand alone in the dark in the middle of a bridge way out in the middle of nowhere, your mind is definitely already on edge. You're expecting something. So sometimes your brain, it gives it to you. Now, when it comes to Maryland, skeptics, they lean hard into one explanation. They claim that it's mass hysteria. They point to the newspaper coverage and they say that once that story hit the headlines, people, they started seeing what they expected to see. A tall, unnatural creature in the woods, and of course, they heard strange noises at night. This was fear, and it was spreading from person to person. And when it comes to the more violent stories, like those axe attacks, they'll just say that those were exaggerations that grew over time as the legend grew. They even talk about the dog incident. They'll argue that that could have been the work of a wild animal, something like coyotes or foxes. They claim that it was definitely something natural and not supernatural. Now look, I have to say this before I go on. None of those explanations are crazy. In fact, they're the most logical places to start. But when you step back and you look at the bigger picture, that's where things, they tend to get a little complicated. Because now you're not just dealing with one story. You're dealing with multiple incidents. You have different places, different people, and different years. And yet the descriptions, they tend to line up into some really strange ways. The tall figure, the moving upright, the staying in wooded areas. Rosie, if you don't hush, I swear to God. Sorry about that, y'all. The appearing at night and leaving people absolutely shaken. You can explain, one story away, maybe even two. But when the same kind of details, they start showing up again and again, to me, that's when it gets harder to just write everything off. So after all that, I feel like here's what we need to be asking ourselves. Are all of those people mistaken? Could it be that all of them are misunderstanding animals, exaggerating stories, or scaring themselves in the dark? Or is there something out there that people occasionally run into, something that doesn't fit neatly into any category that we understand? Because at the end of the day, whether you believe these stories or not, they've been around for a long damn time, and they haven't gone away. And maybe that's the hardest part to explain. Okay, guys, we're to the part where I give my 2 cents as to what I think this thing really is. Out of every single thing that we've covered this month, we had Bigfoot, we had the Mothman, then we had that damn pale crawling thing that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. But this one right here, it feels different. Because the Goatman, it doesn't just show up and then disappear. It doesn't just get spotted from a distance and then vanish back into the tree line. If the stories are true, this thing tends to get close. And I mean way too close. It tends to touch things, and it definitely leaves a mark. And not only that, it shows up in places where people tend to feel safe. And then it turns those places into something else entirely, like a quiet lake, an old bridge, and a neighborhood where parents felt safe enough to let their kids ride their bikes at night. And after this thing shows up, those places, they don't feel the same anymore. And that's what sticks with me. It's not just the creature, but what it does to the people who encounter it. Because when you listen to those stories, and I mean really listen, there's something that's underneath all of them. It's not just fear, it's confusion. It's that moment where your brain is trying to make sense of something and it just can't. And that's the part that should get under your skin because it forces you to ask questions that most people they don't want to ask. Like, what if we don't actually know what's out there? What if there's still things that's moving in those woods at night that doesn't fit into any category that we understand? Not ghosts, not animals, and not something that we can just explain away and move on. And maybe it's something else, something that shows up just long enough to remind you that you are not as alone as you thought you were. And maybe that's why this story hasn't gone away. Not in Texas, not in Maryland, and not anywhere where people tell the story of the Goatman. Because whether this thing is a legend, a misunderstanding, or something real, it tends to hit the same nerve every single time. That fear that when the lights go out and everything goes quiet, something might be standing just outside the edge of where you can see. It's watching, it's waiting, and you wouldn't even know it until it decided to step forward. And maybe that's the truth about stories like this. Not that they prove anything for sure, but that they remind us how much we still don't understand. Because just like I said in the beginning, one person hears all of this and sees a legend. Another hears the same stories and they think of something that's much more real. And in the end, the truth, it really does depend on where you're standing. Okay, guys, I want to thank you so much for riding along with me on this one. It was definitely deep and it was definitely dark. And honestly, it feels a little too real the longer you sit with it. If you made it all the way to the end, I deeply appreciate you more than you will ever know. Seriously, you guys are the reason that I get to do this. It's something that I love. And believe me, I do not take that lightly at all. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and do me a favor. Go ahead and hit the like button. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and hammer down on that bell so you don't miss a single upload. And if you've got your own cryptid story or your own paranormal encounter or something that you just can't explain, all you have to do is email me at relativeperspective76@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your story, and who knows, maybe we'll be able to put it on a future show. Now, I'm doing my best to build something here. I want to build a community of people who aren't afraid to ask the hard questions, even when the answers, they get a little too uncomfortable. And before I let you go, I want you to remember, if you ever find yourself driving down a quiet road at night and something steps out into your headlights, don't stop, don't wait, and whatever you do, damn sure don't go looking for it after it's gone. All right, y'all, thanks again for watching Relative Perspective. As always, I'm your host, Steven. God bless you. We love you. And have a good night. I'm going to have to spank Rosie, baby. She's been loud this whole time. She's crazy. All right, love you. Bye. Thank you. Rosie, I'm going to get you.